I'd like to invite our speaker who will be talking tonight. So tonight we have Ayre, who will be talking about Wilson's Tales of the Border, a forgotten international literary and publishing sensation. So you'll note from the email that was circulated that Andrew is the founding director of the Wilson's Tales Project, and that's a not-for-profit organisation that has been set up to revive interest in the near-forgotten literary tales of Wilson's Tales of the Borders and of Scotland. So these were a 19th century publishing sensation of vast breadth, depth and reach, and it was commented that at one point every cottar's cottage would have a copy of the Bible, Scots Worthies and Wilson's Tales. So let's welcome Andrew for this evening.
Thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk to you this evening, and welcome to the online listeners as well. So I'm trying to stand aside between you both so you don't just see the back of my head, so hopefully that can work. Personally, just to set expectations, I am very much an enthusiastic amateur. I'm not an academic, I'm not a historian, so I come to this with a lot of enthusiasm, but a very amateur approach. So please forgive me if I lose my way, get lost, ramble off on various tangents and come back. What I do like to do, however, I'm sure there's some very academic and knowledgeable people here tonight, but I do like to have a feel for my audience. So firstly, I assume you can all read? Yes, a few nods there. And I assume you do occasionally read books, given the nature of the society. Yes, again, a few nods. How many have read Walter Scott's? Pretty much most of you. Good. How many of you read more than one Walter Scott? Nearly as many. How many of you have heard of Wilson's Tales of the Borders before you saw this advertised? So again, about half of you. And how many of you have read any of Wilson's Tales? 2 of you. Okay, interesting. We'll come back to that maybe a little later on. And really, tonight I think Wilson should be as well known and as famous as Scot was. And part of the idea of the project is just to revive interest in him, his legacy, everything that he did, and wonder, what would have happened if things had turned out a little differently. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to go back over a little bit of the background to Wilson, what his early life was like, the birth of the tales themselves. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the tales, including a sort of summary of 1 or 2 of my more favourite ones. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the publishing history of the tales. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we at Wilson's Tales Project has been doing. I've brought a few bits and pieces to show you, as you are a book-loving society, so I thought you might like to see 1 or 2 bits and pieces. It's a small fraction of the collection I have at home, but I was basically limited to what I could reasonably carry. So I shall kick off on that basis. So firstly, our kind of central character here is John Mackay Wilson, who was born in Tweedmouth, just south of the Tweed at Berwick-on-Tweed, on the 15th of August, 1804. Now, his mother was from Tweedmouth, and his father was from Dunners in Berwickshire. So he grew up very much as a kind of cross-border background. His father with all the kind of heritage of the borders and the border ballads and everything that had been happening there. He lived in a very busy port. Berwick raised a quarter of the tax revenues. You've got to remember, before railway lines came along, because a lot of trade went to Flanders and those areas, and before the roads were improved. So it was a busy, busy place. He grew up in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars, really, so it was a nation at war that he grew up in. He was apparently quite a talented pupil at the local school, but like many, his parents didn't afford an ongoing education for him, so he left school at 12, I think it was, and joined the local printing firm, Lockheed, I think it was called, on the High Street. And he continued his education by essentially reading everything that was getting printed. So that's how he continued educating himself. His first publication was a glance at Hinduism, which he persuaded his employer to print, I think, 200 copies of when he was 15. So that was his first publication. He then, like many young men, decided he wanted to see what the world had to offer him. And when he'd been jilted in love by a local young lady, he decided to head for London to make his fortune. He was spectacularly unsuccessful at that, and had to be rescued by friends who basically paid his fare to get him back to Berwick, and get him back on his feet. But Berwick wasn't really the place for him. So for the next few years, he wandered around various parts of the country. He was in Manchester, he was in Edinburgh, he was in Leeds. He worked as a lawyer's clerk doing copying. He wrote some plays. He wrote 3 or 4 plays which were produced in Edinburgh to great critical acclaim. There was the Rose of Anjou. There was the Gowrie Conspiracy, and he did one called Siege, and there was a 4th one as well. And unfortunately, we've only got the manuscripts of one of those plays still survives, the Siege. The other 3 at the moment are lost, which is a shame. He wrote poetry, a lot of poetry, and he actually travelled the country lecturing on poetry. So he gave talks on it, and we've got reports from things like the Leeds magazines, newspapers, Manchester newspapers reporting on his talks. He was apparently a very good orator. They compared him to some of our best actors, strutting the stage and highs and lows of volume and emphasis, and his criticism of what poetry should be about, what it shouldn't be about, and examples of his own work. He pulled all that together and published it in a book called The Enthusiast, which was the name of his longest poem. We only know of 3 copies of that exist at the moment. There's one in the Berwick Borough Museum. There is one at the Literary and Philosophical Society in Newcastle, and I think there's one up in Dundee somewhere as well. It's quite a short little book, about that sort of size. The first 30-odd pages are basically his lecture on poetry, and then he has about 40 of his own poems in there, including one called Bacon and Beans, which I'll come back to later on. Okay, a very amusing tale. He wanted to be a writer. That's really what he wanted to do. We know quite a bit about him because we've got, actually a new one and show you his picture, actually. Sorry, this is where I get lost, so I should be showing you these pictures. So here we are. So there he is, John McCable's, painted by James Sinclair in 1833. And that picture is hanging in Berwick Art Gallery. There's a very similar one taken in 1830, or painted in 1835, I should say, which is held by the National Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh. So there were 2 oil paintings of him, and there were various etchings which have been taken from that are published within the book. So we've got a fairly good idea what he looked like. I think, incidentally, the James Sinclair that painted this, I think, was probably the same James Sinclair who was the Lloyd's agent in Berwick at the time, and I think probably rescued him from London when he was down there on business. So he was a kind of lifelong friend, but was also a local amateur painter. So he really wanted to be, an author, to publish things and all the rest of it. We know quite a little bit about his character and his life in those mid-1830s, because he has correspondence with a friend called Everett, who was a Methodist minister in Manchester. And we have one side of the correspondence that went to him, which is with the National Library of Scotland, just up the road there. And the first letter is dated the 4th of February, 1832. Same date, incidentally, that Chambers' Edinburgh Journal was published. The first edition of that came out, and my late wife's birthday. So a little bit of resonance with that. So he wrote to his friend Everett, "I trouble you with this under much perplexity and painful feeling. Coburn and Bentley have informed me that owing to their present engagements being so numerous, they could not undertake the publication of my work with any hope of doing it justice until next season." Now, they were his publishers in London. He obviously had a book he was trying to get published. And he goes on to say they were very everybody was preoccupied with the great debate at the time, which is about the Great Reform Act and whether the franchise should be extended to allow more people to vote, which Wilson was very much in favour for. And again, later in his life, he was to campaign quite heavily for that. He goes on to say he has to go to London to see if he can get this book published. He may have to remain for 2, perhaps 3 weeks in London before he obtains a settlement. And upon the cheapest calculation which I can make, I find it would require £2 more than I am possessed of. He's asking for money. And he said, "Do let me know as soon as possible. I would have called on you, but I could not. It is with pain I've written this, and spoken it I could not. So that's the very first of his letters, that he's asking for some money for a loan to go to London to try and get his book published. It doesn't actually happen, but what does happen is that he gets invited to come back to Berwick-on-Tweed to become editor of the Berwick Advertiser, which was the local paper. And that appeals to him. In his correspondence, he said, "Powerful magnets draw me north." So he was determined to do that. From his correspondence, it looked like he walked most of the way because he couldn't afford the carriage. He gave lectures at Manchester and Leeds on the way up. At that time, he was talking about the temperance movement. He was a great believer in that. So he gave talks about temperance in Leeds and Manchester, which were well attended. And eventually he got back to Berwick, keen to be independent editor of the Berwick Advertiser. And this he did, with considerable skill. One of my colleagues, Michael Fraser, has written a book about his time as editor of the Advertiser and how he expanded that. He put far more political commentary into it, rather than just local stuff. It became known almost as Wilson's paper rather than the Berwick Advertiser. But he knew his time there was perhaps limited because the owner's son was coming back from Edinburgh University and was lined up to be taking over. So he had to kind of think of something else to do to secure his position. What he had been doing when he was short of news was he put some of his own little poems or his own short stories in to fill the space up. And so that's how he kind of really started publishing his work, and they were fairly well received. So that gave him a bit of confidence. In his correspondence, he says he talked about emigrating to Canada because he heard the papers weren't very good over there, so there might be an opportunity for him there. He did think about buying the Kelso Chronicle, which had gone bust at the time, and he thought that might be an opportunity. As we know, Walter Scott died in 1832, so he's perhaps thought, his time was coming, gap in the market. Everybody published things as tales in those days. We had Alan Cunningham's Tales of the English Peasantry, which had come out not so long before, and he thought, I'm going to start publishing my own independent tales. So he put an advert. I can find it in the Berwick Advertiser. Here we go. Oh, I did tell you I get lost. So he put an advert in the Berwick Advertiser to announce that Wilson's Tales of the Borders on Saturday next will be published. Number 1, price 3 halfpence, or historical, traditionary, and imaginative Tales of the Borders by John Mackay Wilson. And I think that historical, traditionary, and imaginative is quite key to understanding these tales, because some of the tales are very much at one end of that spectrum and others are at the other end of that spectrum. So it's quite interesting just to look behind the scenes to see whether there's historical facts behind the tales or whether it's purely conjecture. His original plan was to publish 96 editions of this. Okay, he wrote in his correspondence to Everett that he was going to rival Chambers' Edinburgh Journal, which had been published on, as I said, the 4th of February 1832. The first volume had come out, and again, so that's what it looked like. That's the very first edition of Chambers' Edinburgh Journal. Again, Wilson was differentiating himself. There's a more or less, full broadsheet size. He was going to come out in kind of foolscap size, A4 size. So he was a tabloid rather than a broadsheet. So again, that was an important differentiator, I think, from the outset. Ambitiously, he published 2,000 copies a week, which was thought to be quite ambitious at the time. Publishing by installments, as I'm sure you all know, was really the mode that people did that in these days. Dickens novels came out in installments initially. And I like to think of the tales as being a bit like our modern soap opera, but a bit like you waited for Downton Abbey on a Sunday night to see what was happening next. You'd wait for the next edition of Wilson's Tales to come out, and you would read it round the fire as a family, to see what the next tales were. And I think that was very much the feeling one gets for these things, that there were family reading, there were read around the fire, people looked forward to getting them. They were very much promoted as being moral tales. so that they could be read on the Sabbath. Quite important in your marketing in those times. So 2,000 a week, off he set. Wildly ambitious. But very soon he had to double that to 4,000, then 8,000, then 16,000. And within a year, they were reprinting from the start, and they were making arrangements to distribute 30,000 copies a week. Now, if you bear in mind, Walter Scott's first novel, I think, sold something like 6,000 copies in its first 4 months or thereabouts. So arguably he was outselling Walter Scott by a considerable margin. In the meantime, he was continuing his day job as the editor of the Berwick Advertising, organising all the printing distribution, writing the tales, figuring out the money side of it. You know, he said in one of his letters, I'm not quite sure how I'm going to get paid, but I'm sure there are a lot of people. Unfortunately, he took ill and the exertion was too much for him. So he died on the 2nd of October, 1835, less than a year after he started publications in 1834. You know, hadn't got terribly far into these publications. This was announced in the tales. I just want to read you a bit of this. So we got to edition 49. It was then announced, "It is our painful duty to send around the land the tidings of the lamented death of Mr. John Mackay Wilson, the author of these tales. This event has come upon us at an hour when in truth we looked not for it." And it goes on to tell us a little bit about his life and what he'd been doing and all the rest of it. But importantly, it also tells us, he goes here, he has left a widow, respectable and respected. And from what we have said of his struggles through many a dark year, she is left to depend on the profits of his works for the comforts necessary for her till she sinks to rest with him in the grave. Nor are her prospects dark, if those who cheered him on in his literary labours still stand by him. His materials are not yet exhausted, and tales yet untold are in reserve to keep alive his memory. So in other words, they're encouraging people to keep buying the tales because they have more tales to publish. Now, the reality of that is the last tale that was actually published was called The Minister's Daughter. And it came out in about 5 installments. And I think effectively it was a novel that Wilson had written that they chopped up and published while he was ill to keep the thing going. And when he died, I don't think there really were many other tales to be told, because the very next tale that came out was about the outback Coldingham Abbey, which, and again, there'd just been a history of Coldingham had been published by Dr. Carr of Coldingham, and they went to him to write the next tale. But the momentum that kept going, it had been hugely popular and successful by then. His brother, who was called James rather than John, and I think Wilson himself called himself Mackay Wilson, I think, to differentiate himself from his brother, worked for a printer in Edinburgh, John G. Sutherland, and he took over the publishing bit. And other tales were found, so the process continued. And actually, it became a thing, a bit like Blackwood's, that people submitted work to and wanted to get published in. You know, the work of it all became too much really for the printing company, so they appointed a chap called Thomas Layton to be editor, and he was a large contributor to the tales in the years to come. And I think in many ways, probably responsible for why it's not so well known now as it should be, because his own literary style was very verbose, long-winded, and tedious and difficult to read. And he put about 70 or 80 of his own tales into future editions, but I think he also received contributions from other people. And we ended up with another 30 or so different contributors putting in tales, and it became Wilson's Tales of the Borders and of Scotland. So its whole coverage becomes much, much wider. You know, we get the tales in the East League of Fife, we get the minister's tales, the soldiers' tales, we get people going off to India, we get adventures in the West Indies, we get the fur trappers in Canada. It ends up covering some 650 years or so of Scottish history, contributed by about 40 different people. Some of it well written, some of it badly written, some of it in quite broad Scots dialect. And actually in the later editions, they published a glossary of the Scots dialect in the back of volume 6 for the benefit of people that struggle to follow that. So it became a bit of a disjointed thing, but it carried on for another 5 years. So in total, that publication was published for 312 editions, some 485 different tales, depending on exactly you count, covering about 650 years of Scottish history. It was hugely popular, hugely successful. Wilson's grave memorial can still be found in Tweedmouth Church in Berwick. In the middle, at the moment, we're looking at options to try and get that restored and renovated. We've got a price for it. We just need to find the money. But it's there to be seen. Wilson himself, you'll be pleased to hear, was a book collector. He apologises in one of his letters to Everett, who lent him the money. Yeah, here we go. I received the letter on 31st March. So Everett obviously wrote back to him, but we don't have that correspondence. And he's managed to get a perfect, excellent folio edition of Parker's Black Letter Bible, printed in 1611. There was a good deal of competition, but I was a successful bidder, and you will perhaps pity my bibliomania. You must not be too severe. I would rather want victuals for a day than the book that I desire, and my library is already assuming no mean appearance. So he's a keen book collector. Later he goes on to apologise he hasn't yet paid his debt off, so obviously he's prioritised buying books to settling his debt with his friend. But we get some useful insights into his life from that. Now, and again, if you just want to see, so that is the original correspondence, copy of that from the National Library. There's about, I think, a dozen different letters in there, some of them slightly longer than others. But they do give a very interesting insight. I might come back to that if we've more time at the end. And I want to move on and tell you a little bit about some of the tales. So the very first one that came out was called The Vacant Chair. And I'll read you a little bit from this. This story was actually printed in the Berwick Advertiser. And it also appeared in a Canadian publication that somebody contacted me about. And they were wondering, where that had come from. So The Vacant Chair. You have all heard of the Cheviot Mountains. They are a rough, rugged, majestic chain of hills, which a poet might term the Roman wall of nature, crowned with snow, belted with storms, surrounded by pastures and fruitful fields, and still dividing the northern portion of Great Britain from the southern. With their proud summits piercing the clouds and their dark, rocky declivities flowing upon the glens below, they appear symbolic of the wild and untamable spirits of the borderers who once inhabited their sides. We say you have all heard of the Cheviots and know them to be very high hills, like a huge clasp riveting England and Scotland together. And then he goes on to introduce us to March Law and the Elliot family that lived there. And quite interestingly, Peter Elliot, who's the farmer there, doesn't quite know whether he's Scottish or English, because the farmhouse actually straddles the border, and he's not quite sure which bedroom he was actually born in. And when they have big meals there, they set the table out and find the bit. So at one end they have roast beef and things common to England, and trotters and sheep's head at the other end, and things common to Scotland, and vegetables and things common to both countries in the middle. So it's and I think to a certain extent that gives us a little bit of a flavour of the borders, the tales, where it's all coming from, that ambiguousness of the borders in terms of where you are, who you are, the background to it. The long and short of the story is that he sends away some smugglers that are trying to kind of go through his land, who get a bit peeved, and they end up kidnapping his son, take him to Berwick, and he ends up getting press ganged onto a boat and disappears for many years. That's quite a common theme as well. I mean, if you went for an errand to a port in those days, there was a fair chance you weren't coming back for a few years. So quite a few of the tales involve people on unintended maritime adventures and eventually coming home to tell them. So he went off many years, ended up as a prisoner of war in Napoleonic times, ended up fighting the battle against the Dutch, and eventually comes home some years later. His parents don't recognise him, but his girlfriend does, and they've kept this vacant chair for him at the table. So he sits in it to cause huge offence to his parents, who then suddenly realise who this swarthing 29-year-old that's all tanned and full of muscles is. No longer the 16-year-old son, it's the returned son. So it's a good ending, that one. We have literary dinner now for Wilson, which we actually had on the anniversary of his birthday, about 4 now. And first year we invited the editor of the various advertisers to come along as our guest. He didn't come, so we ended up with a vacant chair. So we actually thought that was rather appropriate. So we now have maintained that tradition of having a vacant chair at our dinner to celebrate Wilson. And we also theme it on Bacon and Beans, which I said I would come back to, which is one of Wilson's more amusing poems. So the gist of the poem is that a tramp is out on the road, cold, wet, hungry, raggedy clothes, picks up a bit of paper, unfolds it, and it's a £20 note. So he's delighted, yippee. So he's off to the pub, orders ale and beans and bacon and cheese, and takes a room for the night, and generally has a jolly good time with these newfound £20 notes. Wakes up in the morning to find there's an uproar downstairs. It's a forgery. So he's literally out the back window in his underpants, gets a couple of miles down the road where he's apprehended, brought in front of the magistrates, who's having none of his excuses, and he's sent at Her Majesty's pleasure overseas. He does his 14 years penal service and then becomes a free man. He's actually becomes very successful. So he celebrates his good fortune of finding that forged note that gave him a fresh start in a new country by having a feast of bacon and beans for all his family and retainers each year. So we've revived that as the theme of our Wilson Memorial Dinner. And hopefully we can keep that going and keep it a bit like a burn supper type thing that keeps going in Berwick. We started just as a small thing for our committee as a bit of an amusement. And we started a 100-word tale for that as well. We actually had over 100 entries this year from 4 different continents. So we recite the poem, we do a poem about the Tweed, and then we have the shortlisted 100 tales as our little bit of after dinner entertainment. So we started with, I think, 6 of us from the committee. We now had 25 this year, so that's something that we can grow going forwards. Right, so that was the first tale. Again, I'll just whiz through a couple of the ones that kind of catch my eye as well. The Far's Revenge. This one's based down near Alwynton, Clennell, kind of mid-Northumberland on the edge of the Cheviot. And again, the gist of this story is some gypsies come into the local big house and start chatting to the servants and the staff and everything. And before long, they're talking about the watches and the possessions and all sorts of stuff going on. And the Lord of Clennell comes down, absolutely furious, kicks them out. So stop thieving all this stuff from, my staff. You're thieving whatever's. Well, you could, and the Lord Far, who's like king of the gypsies, takes offence to this. And he says, how dare you call us thieves? We may take the odd chicken and cow when we need it, but you Normans came and stole the very land itself, which I thought was actually quite an interesting take in terms of the gypsies. Again, gypsies feature quite a bit. I think there was quite a lot of fascination with gypsies at the time. Little Egyptians, they were called that a little bit as well. So sometimes you'll see them called Egyptians rather than gypsies. And so that's the Far's Revenge. Anyway, so the gypsies steal the son. So again, there's a lot of stealing of children involved in quite a few of the tales, and take him off, bring him up as a gypsy, and he ends up confronting his father in the English Civil War. And the son nearly kills the father, but the mother of the gypsies kind of intervenes because she can't see this happen, and all's reconciled and ends happily in that one. Thomas of Chartres. Again, long-winded tale, but quite an interesting one. And this is basically William Wallace going to Scotland to try and raise funds and support for the Scottish cause. And he gets basically overrun by pirates in the Irish Sea, who kind of trick him and get him on board. And Thomas of Chartres is the main pirate. And he's actually, he was a knight that fought in the Crusades and got on the wrong side of somebody in a love gist and was kind of poofed out and became an outlaw, if you like, and a pirate. And then Wallace and Chartres end up getting on quite well. They go back to France, rescue some friends. He ends up in French court. And again, there is historical evidence that he was there. So the representatives of Wallace were in France collecting stuff. Wallace, I think, is buried in Dunfermline Cathedral, I think. And again, the tomb there, the stone for it, was donated by the Duke of Chartres. So again, there does seem to be some connection in that. So perhaps a little bit of truth behind that tale. On to Polwarth Church now. So this is a very true tale. We definitely know this one's true. This is the Tale of Marchant. Sir Patrick Hume, the Tale of Marchant. So again, we're in the troubled times in Scotland when they were opposing things English and things getting imposed on them. Sir Patrick Hume was on the wrong side of the political battle and was about to get captured and probably executed for his part in the Rye House conspiracy. Word got to him in time, so he went and hid in the vault under Polworth Church. So that's Polworth Church as it stands. If we look at the back, there's a little kind of couple of windows you can see at ground level there. Again, inside there is the vault of the Hume family at that time. And he hid in there, and his daughter Grizzle smuggled food out to him in the middle of the night. And the lantern she carried it by is again in the National Museum of Scotland. So it's one of the exhibits in there. He eventually managed to escape over to Holland and came back to William of Orange, and his estates were restored and lived happily ever after, and became, you know, leading Scottish politician, and lived till well into his 70s or 80s. And the beans were nearly spilt because his daughter Grizzle had wrapped things up in a napkin to take down to him, and the slightly younger son spotted her doing this. He said, "Grizzle's stolen the whole sheep's heed," and nearly raised questions about why this was happening. This here is my partner's aunt, also called Grizzle, holding a napkin embroidered by Grizzle off the tail. And my partner is actually the great granddaughter of Sir Patrick Hume. So we definitely know that story is true, and a lot of it's kind of in there and pertinent to what we're doing. There's numerous other tales. I'll maybe come back to some of my other favourites later on if we run out of time. So what happened to the tales after they came out? So a lot of them were published kind of unbound. So this again is a copy of some of the, this is actually a reprint rather than the original. There's a nice portrait of Wilson in the front. And we have the number and the price here, and the vacant share being the very first one in there. And then they would be bound together locally because books were distributed unbound, because obviously they were much lighter to do that way. And also if you were buying them by subscription weekly or monthly, you'd wait till you had the whole collection before you got it bound by your local bookbinder to suit your budget and your particular library shelves. So they would come out like that. Finished versions might look something like this. And typically they could be bound in either 3 volumes, 6 volumes. They were in print almost continuously for about 150 years. Okay. This lot were a reprint by Ainsley in Manchester. I think it is that these were printed in. Very common set are ones that are this size. These were published by the Walter Scott Publishing Company and came out in about the 1880s or so. Again, this would come out as a 24-volume set. It's consolidated. There's only about 299 tales out of the 485 that exist. So quite a lot got the cull. I haven't yet figured out on exactly what basis they were culled, and there are some in the 24th volume that were never in the originals. The 24th volume is largely poetry and ballads and things like that. Most are written by Leighton. So I think he was just self-publicizing himself at that point to make up a nice round number. And again, you get some editions of these are actually published as like a double copy. So some of them are double bound like that. So that would be a 12-volume edition, but it's basically the same stuff, 2 together rather than singly. We also get, and again, this looks rather lovely. So again, this is a reprint that came out, and this was priced at 2 shillings. But again, these came out quite late. They look a bit like the originals, but they're not. These came out in about the 1890s, still getting published then. And we know that because they've got adverts on the back. And one of them includes the history of England, updated to include the Boer War and Zulu War. So that kind of gives us a little bit of a date. A lot of the publications we've got haven't got dates, but sometimes you've got little clues like that to tell us. And again, these ones would often be bound. So again, you see quite a lot of variations of Wilson's tales like this that would be bound up like this. This would be a 6-volume set. And again, sometimes they were bound 2 together and would become a 3-volume set, or sometimes even 3 of them together to become a 2-volume set. So again, you see lots of variations on that. They had quite nice illustrations in them. So again, that's Judith the Egyptian, i.e. the gypsy. So that's the kind of love affair with the travelling gypsies. So there's some rather lovely block prints come into those. one of my favourite editions is actually, if you like, an omnibus edition that came out in 1934 and 1947. These came out, various different publishing companies. The Ayre Publishing Company, the Colosseum Publishing Company, which I think the Grand Colosseum Publishing Company, which I think is rather a great name. This is Gall and Ingalls of St Henrietta Street, the Strand in Edinburgh. And again, this has got some rather nice colour prints in it, but a very good introduction. You know, it tells you a bit about the tales, the historic background, so a bit about Wilson, a bit about some of the authors. So, you know, for anybody wanting to find out a bit more, that would be my go-to copy. One of those ones, you pick those up for about 10 quid on the internet, on eBay, and you know, other book sites and things like that. So they're relatively cheap to get if you want a summary of those. Again, just to show you a few pictures of some of the ones that I've kind of collected. So it's another rather nicely bound set of the tales in the full size. That is what I'm trying to do, is get at least one representative volume of every edition we've come across as part of my collection. So you can see in there a number of the different ones that I've managed to acquire. That's part of the collection. Some of them have got rather lovely, you know, covers on them. And again, some more there. Again, the ones we've identified. So we've identified 1830s, 1840s, Ainsworth, 1848, Romancy, Shannon, New York. So there's a New York edition, revised edition 57 to 59, edited by Alexander Leighton by W.P. Nimmo, 1857, Ward and Locke, Thomas and Niven, which is an Australian edition, Adam and Co., John B. Murdoch, the Walter Scott Publishing Company, William Mackenzie, the Grand Colosseum Warehousing Company, founded by Walter Wilson. Don't know if he's related to the supermarket stores or not. The Tyne Publishing Company, the Edinburgh Publishing Company, with notes by James Tate, who was the vicar of Kelso, Macready, Cowan, Castle and Co.'s Red Library, Gressner and Schramm, the Leipzig edition, so a German edition as well, Adam and Co., Wardlock and Brown, Gall and Ingalls, the Murray Press, the Ettrick Press, and the last kind of series, small edition that existed before we came along was probably one by Michael Brander by Mainstream Publishing in 1991. But we find on the inscriptions inside, and a lot of them were given as prizes to school pupils for, you know, for doing stuff really in the early 1900s, the long service. So there was still very much a thing to be given and a thing to be rewarded. Well, the story of Grizzle Cochrane, who basically hijacked the mail to intercept her father's death warrant twice at Berwick. So she dressed as a male, hijacked the Royal Mail, intercepted it till one of the family members basically went and bribed the king with the equivalent of 400,000 to save Sir John Cochrane's life. Became a story with Frank Roscoe's stories for schools in 1935. So a lot of them appeared in other ways. That story also appeared in the girls magazine called Mandy for Girls. I think it was. I brought that with me today as a cartoon tale back in the 50s. So they appear in all sorts of different ways. What have we done as the Wilson's Tales project? So I first became aware of these when I was probably about 11. And we used to go to some family friends on New Year's Day, and whenever we was getting a bit tired, sit down and play charades. And Wilson's Tales of the Borders came up as a charade. Can't remember whether anybody got it or not, but when it was said what it was, the adults all laughed and knew what it was. The kids were completely hadn't a clue. So my dad briefly explained to me what it was about. And I think I've been intrigued with it ever since, you know, and the idea of kind of, I came across some of these tales, read some of them. When I was clearing my mother's house after she died, I came across an edition of the tales, and I think that rekindled my interest a little bit. Now, this belonged to my maternal grandmother, who lived in Stoke-on-Trent. So absolutely no connection with the Borders or Berwick, you know, or Scotland, but she had a copy of the tales. And I thought, we should do something about this. I found a study on the internet that had been done about Wilson, got interested in it. I was keen for Berwick to celebrate this somehow. Our local art centre was keen to do a play. They costed it all out. It was going to cost 40,000 quid. The lottery were quite keen. They couldn't find a playwright. It just wasn't getting anywhere. So in the end, I thought, for heaven's sake, we must be able to do something. It became my midlife crisis to try and revive interest in Wilson's Tales. Due to my skills of organising things, literature, books, live art, and I kind of did a thing in the paper, standing beside the tomb, saying, we should remember this chap. And lots of people came forward. A retired doctor from Eyemouth had written 3 plays, we'd never had them produced. So I said, well, come on, let's get them produced. Another artist came along and said, oh, I've done some pictures about, the blacksmith of plum trees. And I said, oh, would you like to illustrate something else? Oh, yes. So one thing led to another. We did these illustrations about the Red Hall, Berwick 1296, which was the sacking of Berwick by Edward I, I think it was, slaughtered the 7,000 people there. And she did a series of illustrations about that, did a talk about it, and thought, well, it would be nice to turn this into a book. So our first book contained that tale, plus the illustrations, and we also put a little bit about Wilson in, and we put a second tale in called The Royal Raid, which was really the last of the Border Reaver raids, and it was based on the Border Widow's Lament and the hanging of the Reavers by James IV, I think it was, down near St Mary's Loch. And again, the tombs are still there, the evidence is still there. And that then became an annual project. So we've been publishing one of these each year. Typically, it has 6 of the tales that are rewritten in a more readable format for the modern reader, shortened quite a bit. And then we also do what we call a companion piece to go with it. So someone else researches the historic context, how true or untrue it is, whether it's complete myth and fantasy. And again, one of the more interesting ones is Willie Waskell's account of his wife. Now, Willie Waskell was in a poem written by Burns, as I'm sure most of you know, and she was supposedly an ugly creature with a nose that nearly met her chin and all the rest of it. That this chap was defending his wife as being, actually quite a canny, decent woman, but she was opposed to change. And when they got married, he thought, right, we'll have a tea service. And actually there were 8 of them there. He didn't have enough cups and saucers. We thought it'd be fine for them to just drink out the saucers. That would be okay. His wife wouldn't have tea. It was a newfangled thing. She was absolutely furious with him. She wouldn't, he wanted to bring a threshing machine. She wouldn't have that. There was all sorts of problems arose as a result of that. There were riots about the toll roads getting put in to repair the roads, because really nobody's repaired the roads in Scotland since the Romans left in 400. So they're in a pretty dire strait, and that's why maritime trade was such a big thing, because it was actually cheaper to send wool to Bordeaux from Berwick than it was to send it to Glasgow by road. So it needed to be done. And the parody of it was that, because one of their sons ended up in prison because of the protest, the other son was on the cart coming back from market, fell asleep. The cart hit a pothole, he fell off and got run over. So not all the tales end well, but again, so the context for that's quite interesting. So typically 6 tales, 6 companion pieces, some original illustrations, some new illustrations, a few photographs of where's relevant. I've been kind of slowly writing a biography of Wilson and the tales themselves, a chapter at a time each year. And then we've done a writing competition with the local literary festival and Rotary. So we typically, when we've been doing that, get 150 odd entrants from the local schools. And the top 3 entries, one from each age group, get their tale published as part of the prize. So they become a published author as part of the prize, which makes it quite nice to do. We weren't able to run it during one of the pandemic years. So we had a 100-word competition. So our most recent edition has got some of our 100-word tales in the back. So we have a little bit of modern writing in there as well. We were doing 2 live events a year before the pandemic came along. We're getting back into the habit of doing that, where we invite people to interpret the tales. So we have radio plays, we have live performances. We have not done theatre company doing it. We've sponsored a prize at Duns Playfest. So we have the tales presented in different ways. We recorded about 6 or 7 of them as short films, which are available on our website. And again, some of those are very amusing. We've visited castles and done reenactments at castles with picnics and tours. And as I say, we've started the dinner, and we're just trying to keep the thing alive. It's a difficult thing in some ways, though, because Wilson, because he comes from Berwick, the Scots see it as an English thing, and the English see it as a Scottish thing, because it's tales of the borders and of Scotland. So he's almost a little bit discerned in no man's land between the two. So trying to get that, everybody to kind of, go along with supporting him. So he's not recognised in the, the Museum of Literature in Edinburgh. He's not recognised in any way on the literary stuff they've got in Waverley now to celebrate the City of Literature, which I think is a shame. I think he should be in there. In terms of his writing, I did read you a little bit from his very first tale. I think he was actually quite a good writer. I enjoy reading his prose, not so much other people's. And he started as a poet, as everybody did at that time, because poetry was the higher art and literature prose was considered to be a bit base. I think Walter Scott, he used a pseudonym when he first started publishing his books. But he does write quite well, I think. And I think I'll just give you one or two illustrations. Here's a little bit about romance in the tales. So he's talking here about a successful marriage. This is an old couple. She was the world to him, and he was all the world contained to her. And often as gloaming fell grey around them, still they sit and look into each other's eyes, silent and happy, as if God had given naught else worth looking at on this side of heaven. And later on he says, when Helen and her husband age descended imperceptibly, as the calm of twilight of the lovely evening, when the stars steal out and the sunbeams die away, as a holy stillness glides through the air like the soft breathing of an angel, unfolding from his celestial wings and silken curtains a summer night. 80 winters had passed over them. The heads became white with the snow of years. I love that expression, snow of years. That's a great one. So now time is getting on. So I think what I'm going to do at this stage is stop and see. I'll just read you one other thing. So this was an advert in 1887 for a reissue of the Tales at that point in time by Walter Scott. And again, the narrative to this: no collection of tales published in a serial form ever enjoyed so great a popularity as the Tales of the Borders, and the secret of their success lies in the fact that they are stories in the truest sense of the word, illustrating in a graphic and natural style the manners and customs, trials and sorrows, sins and backslidings of the men and women of whom they treat. The heroes and heroines of these admirable stories belong to every rank of life, from the king and the noble to the humble peasant. Many of them deal with the stirring deeds of chivalry and the long struggle for religious independence, while every one of them illustrates more or less manners, customs, and traditions of the period in which they treat. There is another peculiarity by which these tales are characterized, which perhaps more than any other has contributed to their lasting popularity. While true to history, legend, character, and circumstance, their moral tone is such that no father or mother need fear to place the whole series in the hands of their children. The Tales of the Borders have always been immensely popular with the young, and whether we view them in their moral aspect or as vehicles for instruction and amusement, the collected series forms a repertory of healthy and interesting literature unrivaled in the language. So again, still high marketing praise for that in the 1880s. Again, a lot of the tales were about the Covenanters, the whole heap about that, a lot of sympathy for that, a lot of strong female characters, so I think he was quite a kind of feminist in there. So there's a lot of interest in that. But I'm going to start and see if you've got any questions for me at this stage, because I've probably talked long enough. So any questions from the floor?
Do you have any?
I do, yes. So some of our what we call the revival editions, I do have a small section of there. So we've got volume 7 and volume 8 I've brought with me. The others are available through our website. So we do have some little cards for you to take away, which are sitting over there. So again, there's a little kind of summary of a couple of the stories over there. So there are some for sale tonight. And again, if you want other editions or haven't brought money with you tonight, you can order them through our website.
Why do you think he was so phenomenally successful? Because the numbers that you were quoting seemed very large.
I think partly reading ability, the amount of people that could read. He was going into a market where our ability to read, was growing all the time. Education, schools and things were taking off, particularly in Scotland, where we were kind of ahead of the curve in terms of opening schools and educating the general public. So I think there was an ability to read. Was there a gap in the market after Scott died? Was there a readiness to accept these sort of things? I mean, I think he had quite a high reputation already as the editor of the Berwick Advertiser. He'd been in a few different places. He came in a bit cheaper than the opposition. He was, the more readily formatted. I think he just picked the right moment to launch. And it's the fact that it's lasted another 150 odd years. And again, when I first started the project, actually somebody contacted me from Bamber. I kind of known as a family friend for a long time, and they said, "Oh, Andrew, you must come down and see my set of the tales." So Julie went down to see her and had a cup of coffee, and she got them out. And they were very, well-read, dog-eared set of I think that was the William Nimmo edition, quite a big chunky ones. And this lady was probably in her late 70s, early 80s at the time, 5 or 6 years ago. And she said, these were given as a gift to my grandparents and taken with them to New Zealand when they emigrated in the 1870s. You know, and she said, you know, because when you went in those days, you usually weren't coming back.
Mm.
It was, you know, and I think a lot of them were given to people as going away presents to remind them of familiar things of home and familiar names and stories and things like that. Because a lot of them do pop up all around the world that have stayed there. And she brought them back 3 generations later when she came back to get married in Northumberland. You know, so but they were still with the family and had had that journey around the globe. And again, I get contacts through our website from people in Canada that have got them, Australia that have got them. The closest I've got to one of the original editions was somebody from South Africa that contacted me, and he had number 3 of the originals, and it had an inscription on the inside. These were printed by me these were printed by your grandfather in 1834 and rebound by me in 1870 or something like this. It wasn't number 1 and 2 there. So whether he hadn't bought them or whether he hadn't thought they were worth hanging on to or whatever, and then suddenly realized these were actually quite popular, he should buy them or hang on to them. So, you know, so that's the closest to seeing, you know, a copy of the very first edition that came out. So, got a few more here, right?
Easy first. Oh, we just have one question from Graham Lyle online. He was just wondering if Wilson has any descendants.
He didn't have any children himself. We have kind of done some work trying to trace his family. He had 1 brother and I think a couple of sisters, and his closest living descendant that we found was actually an English teacher in Leeds. So we have managed to track down to, because we got his permission to restore the tomb. We had to try and find somebody to get permission to restore the tomb. So the closest we could find, actually we got an email from somebody from, yeah, I think it was Canada about 2 months ago, saying he thought he was related to Wilson. Was there any, you know, recognition of him in Edinburgh? We said no, but there is in Berwick. And come to the dinner if you want to. We never heard back from them, but I'm not quite sure. Don't quite know what the connection is there because he himself had no children. But there was also a Professor John Wilson floating around at the same time. It was something completely different. I think sometimes the 2 Wilsons do get confused. But these are, you know, so whether it was a different Wilson that he was descended from and assumed it was the same, I'm not sure. So yes, we have kind of traced his family through his sister, our local kind of family history society did the work on that.
You mentioned Canada earlier in the early publication. Was he also published and sold abroad?
Yes, there were certainly New York editions. There's an Australian edition. There's a German edition, not actually in German, it was printed in Leipzig. So, you know, sorry?
So there's the new publishers.
Right.
Overseas.
Right. No, not that, no, I think that one was. No, one was. It was no. Bresner and Schramm in Leipzig. So yes, there are foreign editions. I think people took them with them, but they were also republished in those countries. There's another American edition as well, which I've kind of seen online, but haven't actually got it because the trouble is with some of these bulkier ones, the postage cost is kind of fairly phenomenal. You can buy them for $30 or $40, but then find it's going to cost you $120 to get it shipped. You know, but at least you're going to kind of weigh out whether it's worth that much. You know.
My own set is 1988 Walter Scott publishers. In a way, I feel that I must have bought it when I was trying to fill shelves, and I'm carrying to empty shelves now. Still, it's still spread.
Yeah.
But in a way, the Walter Scott publisher, it's come full circle. Walter Scott did leave a bit of a gap, I think, with regard to the borders. The Minstrelsy was an antiquarian publication, never count the sales that some of the later stuff did. Only 2 of the novels, The Black Dwarf, the short stories set in the borders, and Guy Manning, the hero, walks through the borders. That's about it in the novels. But there's one other link, I think, later in Scott's career. That's Tales of My Grandfather,
Yeah.
which is filled with the sort of things that you describe. Anecdotes connecting with Scottish history.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's sort of linked.
Yes, I think there is a little bit of a connection in there, and I think you know, in his correspondence he says we must, you know, to Everett, one must go and see Scott. I'm not sure if he did ever see him, and actually, in Scott's diaries, there is a reference. He says that Wilson has been in touch, but you know, he's a nuisance. I've kind of said no to him, something, but it doesn't make it clear whether it's this Wilson, a completely different Wilson, or the Professor Wilson. But so I think they probably didn't actually see eye to eye. I mean, I think Scott would probably see Wilson as a bit of a liberal, you know, young whippersnapper that promoted the Great Reform Act, whereas Scot was very much against it and was jeered in Jedburgh, I think it was, when he was trying to lecture on that. Whereas Wilson had huge crowds listening to him, talking for over an hour about the reasons why the Reform Act should go forward. And I often wonder, what would have become of him if he'd lived beyond it, beyond the age of 32. If this had continued, been a great success, published more, perhaps he would have become a politician. He was very politically interested. I think that's again another fascinating little bit of historical fiction you could maybe write, sort of imagining that he actually recovered from his illness, and actually this is how his career developed for the next 35 years. And I think who he all crossed paths with in the literary and political world of the 1800s. That would be quite an interesting area to explore and have some fun developing what might have happened to Wilson as a kind of a figure in the background that had quite a lot of influence, meeting people and so forth. The question from the room?
Talking about the tales not from the borders but from the rest of Scotland. Was he writing them, or were they?
No, so Wilson died at the end of edition 49. So he'd contributed each volume. Some of them have one tale in, some of them have 3 tales in, some of them actually serialize a tale over a couple of editions. So he wrote in round numbers probably 70 of the tales that came out. The others were all contributed by other people. So there were no tales by Wilson beyond the date of his death. It was someone else. It was someone else. But it was published as a continuous process.
Yeah.
So I think they knew this was coming. As I say, the last 4 or 5 editions were that serialization of the minister's daughter. So I think in the meantime, there were obviously discussions going on in the background as to what do we do, what happens next. So I think his brother would have been negotiating with the printer up here, that have been reaching out, for that to happen weekly, right the way through, there's actually obviously something was happening.
So after he died, who was responsible for it? Who looked after it, kept it going? And
Well,
were they managing the rights, for other people to print it as well?
Right. Again, the family initially started as they had a brother called James who worked with the printers up in Edinburgh. So he, liaised with them. The printers realised, and I think they sold the rights basically. I think she got a capital sum from my understanding of what was written at the time. And so Sutherland's took on the printing. And actually, again, from what I've read around it, is in those days you were putting together typeset pages to print them. They were reprinting them so often that they stopped dismantling the actual page, and they built an extension to the factory to store these things on the rack, so they could just get them out and keep printing. They didn't dismantle the typesets.
But they probably stereotyped them, did they?
I think, yeah, well, I think possibly, because it certainly refers to one of them being printed on the Brown's printing presses, I think it is. So, I mean, you're obviously more knowledgeable on this than me, but by all means have a look at what I've brought along at the end.
If they were keeping something and wanted to reprint it like that, they'd take a cast of the original,
Yeah. Mhm.
the original page, well,
Yeah.
sorry, the original typeset. And then they got a solid block that they could
Yeah.
print from. And that's
Yeah, that certainly refers to the building an extension that was getting printed so often, and I think publishers definitely must have. So I think they must have the rights went off to various other people that came along, and then I think there's a huge surge of the republications in the late 1800s. So I think copyright at that time was about 70 years or so. It came out of copyright. I think a lot of people jumped on the bandwagon then. It was a huge, flurry of new editions came out in the kind of 1870s, 80s, 90s, when the copyright was around.
So there's no identifiable editorial hand after his
Oh,
death.
Thomas Layton.
Right.
So he became the editor. So I think Sutherland employed him as the editor. He wrote quite a lot of them himself. He selected the other tales that were submitted, and then it came to an end as a body of work in edition 312. And actually, the very last tale is called The Last Tale, and it's set in the Hen and Chickens pub in Berwick-on-Tweed, and it's the editor and the publisher deciding whether they should carry on or whether it needs to come to an end now. And all the various characters that have been in the tale come in, for a pint of beer and put the tuppence worth in and all the rest of it. So it's this imaginary scene of all the various characters that are featured coming in. And again, I think that would be a great one to do as a play. But I'm still reading my way through them myself at the moment. So I think I read number 331 today. So I've still got plenty to go. Familiarise myself with all the characters and reread that one. Because I think that would be a rather fun thing to do.
Thank you.
Kind of thing. Again, contrasting with Scot again, I mean, Scot you know, it was long stuff, it was high drama, it was chivalry, etc. So Wilson's was short and sharp. It was very much about ordinary people, ordinary situations. You know, I think really common people could identify with more than Scot. It was available weekly, and I think that the quote you referred to earlier, that every cotter's cottage had the Bible, Scott's Worthies, and Wilson's Tales, not Scott's novels. You know, these were very widespread. And again, speaking to auctioneers and people, book dealers and people like that, they were sick of seeing Tales of the Borders. They were so common. They pretty much got chucked out because, you know, every third house clearance in Scotland and the Borders had a set of tales. You know, and again, a lot of people have maybe got one volume, another volume, quite a few people have got one of these big volumes, but they got split up. So they were, you know, they were very, very common.
You may have said this already, but many of the 20th century editions contain the tales written, only the tales written by Wilson himself.
I don't think so, to be honest. I mean, one of the bits of work we'd like to do is to have a super spreadsheet, you know, and have an edition tale, who we wrote it. We know some of wrote some of them, but not all of them. The Walter Scott edition, which was edited by Makeley, gives the names of the authors. But the originals don't give the names of the authors, and certainly the ones that didn't make the cut, we'll never know the authors of. So we know about 30 named authors, but it could well be a lot more than that didn't make it into the late edition. And just to see, you know, which ones in which editions. The 20th century ones are rewritten, so they are more readable. You know, they were certainly edited down to be more readable than the originals.
Do we have any last questions?
Any more from news? Sorry. Thank you.
Just thanks and nice comments.
Can we thank and that excellent presentation in the usual manner?
We will come up and have a look at it. We've all been to, you know.
Our next meeting with the 17th of November, also here in person one, but we'll be having online facilities, and we will be having Professor Tom Moore, who will be talking about my pen is at the bottom of the page, later manuscript. Thank you very much, everybody.